Hello Biz welcomes Brenda Sterling, founder and principal of Omega Resources. Brenda has more than 40 years financial, organizational, and managerial experience working with clients ranging from startups to international Fortune 500 companies. Areas of expertise include financial systems, corporate infrastructure design and development, process design and implementation, Sarbanes-Oxley compliance, policy and procedures, internal control, operational efficiency and effectiveness, mergers and acquisitions, and training. An accomplished entrepreneur, Brenda has also successfully started and operated her own 2 businesses. Her passion for sharing her knowledge led her to design and conduct numerous seminars in the US and in Europe on a wide variety of business issues, for which she garnered national recognition in USA Today and Vogue magazine. Along with a BS in accounting from the University of New Orleans, Brenda has extensive continuing education in the fields of management, finance, and interpersonal skills. And welcome, Brenda. It's so great to see you again after so much time. We're actually going to talk a little bit about restaurants. I know that in your background, you've had multiple experiences across a multitude of industries working with the financial operational sides of businesses. So today we're going to dig down deep and dig deep we need to with regard to restaurants, and specifically even restaurants wherever anybody might be listening. My experiences with them in California. And so we'll just take it from there. I mean, as you said, we're at a huge crossroads.
Thank you, Jules. Restaurants, with all the different companies that I've worked with, I think restaurants are probably the most vulnerable right now with the pandemic, because it really does touch every piece of a restaurant, from the vision of the restaurant to the operations to the structure to the employees. Everything is affected all at one time, and it's interesting to see how the various restaurants are trying to cope with what they see going on. So what I want to do is just sort of touch on some of the items that people really need to think about when they're talking about their restaurant right now during the pandemic and trying to reopen. What does that mean, and what does it look like for a business like a restaurant? And most of the time I'm going to be talking more about the smaller, the individually owned restaurants as opposed to the large chains. I will add a few comments in about the chains as we go along, because it's actually affecting them just as much as it's affecting the small ones. It's just that the smaller restaurants generally don't have the ability to cope with any kind of a cash flow issue for any amount of time.
In our prep, sir, when we were kind of hashing this around, was the issue with regard to businesses, all businesses, but particularly restaurants, knowing when to stop digging. You know, how deep is that hole going to get before you have to pull a plug, or what decisions do you need to make a reasonable decision, as opposed, a head over heart decision about the restaurant that has probably been a huge part of your life for a really long time.
What I'm finding as I'm talking to people is that it really depends on where you are in your life cycle of the restaurant. If you're a startup, you have one set of problems that you're dealing with. If you're a more established restaurant, you have those problems to deal with. If you are kind of at a stalemate and your business isn't going anywhere before the pandemic, that's a different set of issues. So when you're looking at your restaurant, you really have to look not only at what your operations are and what the restaurant was, but also what is it that you feel like you can do going forward. So for instance, if you've been in business a really long time and the business has been around for a long time and you're not a young person anymore, you're an older person, considering how long it's going to take for all of this to settle out, is that something you really have the energy to do over the next 5 years to get yourself back to something that may resemble, hopefully, what you had before, but likely not? Or are you just starting out and can very easily change to something new? So part of it is, where are you in the whole process, and what is it you want to have in your life 5 years from now? Had you been planning on retiring in 5 years? Were you planning on growing? What were your plans before, so that you know how to shape it? The other problem right now is with the restaurants is that it's not just your restaurant you have to worry about, it's society you have to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
You may open your restaurant, but are people going to come back? And are you going to be able to have the kind of restaurant that you really want? Because a restaurant's a high touch business. I mean, people interact, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have that warm, comfy, cozy feeling, which if you've been into a restaurant in the past couple of weeks, they're anything but warm and fuzzy right now. They're very, very uninviting. And it's going to be very hard to create an environment when you have to deal with all the restrictions that are out there right now. So, and then will people feel comfortable coming back? And when will they feel comfortable coming back? And if you have the ability to last that out. And that goes back to what you were saying about digging the hole. I mean, if you were already sort of right at the edge and this is hitting, you're talking about a fairly long time before you can make a turnaround. And do you really have the ability to last it out? Do you have a way of getting the resources in that you need? And can you reimagine your business a different way to make it worthwhile for you?
About 2 months ago, when it became clear that we were not going to be out of lockdown anytime soon, one of the things I was doing in my blog, for example, was writing about taking this time, a time when it was necessary to do a brand pivot. Like one of the things, as you're going through your checklist of what you need to do, one of the things you needed to do was really figure out how are you going to realign the brand with what the public wants and needs and expects. You know, their expectations and their needs are completely different now from what they expected before and what they expect now and how they want to be catered to and cared for. But when they come in, it's going to be a very different look. And actually on this, when I go back and do some editing, I have some photographs that I took around San Francisco, for example, of how restaurants are meeting the new look even to do the social distancing, just as one small piece of this. We were talking about just in the restaurant business being so incredibly complicated. They're impacted everywhere. I don't think a lot of restaurants have probably even had a chance to even think about that right now. There's so many other things that were up in the air.
It's actually really interesting because I don't know of any restaurant that really knows for sure what they should be doing. Because it goes from county to county and every county has their own rules, and you have to have a written document that says this is what I'm doing to meet the criteria that's required. And it's all in flux because these things can change, you know, as soon as any kind of new information comes out, they can now add another line to the list of things that you need to do. And the hard part with trying to shift yourself all of a sudden is you don't really know what the people want yet. You don't know what people are going to feel comfortable with. You may go to patio dining, but people may still feel uncomfortable even going to a restaurant because you still have the issue of people touching everything and how is the food prepared and all of that sort of thing. So we don't know yet, I think, exactly what the demand is going to be. And generally speaking, when you have a patio seating arrangement, it's not as efficient as what an in-house seating arrangement is. So as a result, you know, you're not using your square footage as well as you could to get the kind of revenue that you need. So in most cases, just shifting to a patio environment may not give you the revenue that you need to meet all of the costs that you have to do. And the cost to implement all of these changes are huge, and they're ongoing. They're like forever, you know, right now. Until we know what's going on, you have to assume that a certain amount of these requirements will be there indefinitely. for people to feel comfortable, or for the the public to feel comfortable. The other issue is that with a lot of the restaurants making all of these changes and doing what they're doing, they also have to consider a whole lot of other issues other than just the people and the virus. They have to think about all of their other legal issues and everything that goes along with it. So it becomes a much more complicated process than just trying to figure out how you're going to seat people or how you're going to keep your staff sanitized and the building sanitized. It becomes a much bigger process because it's going to affect every piece of your operation, and it has some other consequences down the road for you that you may not be thinking about, both from a legal aspect or insurance or other kinds of requirements that you're going to have down the road. So the financial obligation keeps going and going and going with this without a real clear picture of where you're going to get the revenue to cover all of these costs.
Right. I think you and I had talked a little bit about the whole issue around liability as just opening up a huge can of worms beyond what, I mean, it was already bad, and now it will just be sort of ongoing because they're still defining what the issue, what the word is in terms of policies, in terms of liability in the restaurant or any public gathering space, the liability issues, whether or not it is or isn't covered in an insurance policy, where is it covered? And then the fact that I know that there is ongoing, for example, legislation right now in multiple states where even if it was an excluded item in an insurance policy, that it's now being talked about that it's going to be retroactively applied to a policy that's been held by a company for however long. That has ramifications of its own. So I could foresee, having lived through and worked closely in the work comp mess in the 90s, that this could evolve into something along those lines for restaurants and any other place where there's people gathering. When you talk about the operations side, I know this is going to have a huge impact on operations. And for example, just for a minute, look into that whole 6-foot issue. Okay, so we've got patio dining available right now, but no interior dining. So that sets up people who either do or don't. And then if you don't, you have to, there's a subset of, do I have the ability to create patio side dining, and what does that look like? And I know that when you come out of the pandemic, the first thing is like, wow, I can get back to business. I can actually do what I was meant to do, which is running a restaurant, except that restaurant now might be anywhere from 2 tables outside your front door on the sidewalk, which wasn't probably set up for it. And maybe if you live in a city that's going into that, closing off streets and creating pedestrian thoroughfares, at least for the short term, which again, never turns out to be short term, but that's a whole other issue. That looks like, okay, so maybe 2 seats, 4 seats, and 6 feet apart. And that's a very small portion of a net to cover in terms of your overall operation. And you're open and it's costing you labor and food and overhead, et cetera, but you can only throw 4 or 6 seats at it, and you have to have 100% occupancy, and et cetera, et cetera. So with things like that, and then when we do come out of the patio and have the interior dining, for example, taking out 50 or 60% of your tables for the foreseeable, if not the long-term future, impact on bottom line for that. Because I know you and I have worked together on the same restaurants. We've consulted together. And I know that, 100% occupancy is like a unicorn. So address some of that.
Yes, I'm in New Mexico, so we actually do have some indoor dining now. They can do up to like 25% or so indoor dining. And I think in parts of California, parts of them are allowing indoor dining. Up in, I know Napa and Sonoma are allowing, I think it's 25% right now.
Okay.
But the problem is a lot of the restaurants aren't opening for indoor dining because they can't operate. I mean, you have to staff up. You have to do all of the stuff you have to do inside to keep everything sanitized. And at 25%, you're not even covering your cost to open your door at that point. And you also have to think about it from an employee standpoint. If you're only doing 25%, then you have a lot less hours people can work, a lot less tips people can make. And right now, people are making a lot more on unemployment than they would make in a restaurant right now because they're not at the level that they were before. So it would be really difficult for people to try to bring people back, keep them employed, and try to meet a livable wage for them at a 25% occupancy.
Right.
It just doesn't, the numbers don't work out for anybody at that point. So a lot of the restaurants I'm hearing, they're saying, you know, they're just not, they're sticking with the takeout. They're going to stick with the patio dining, you know, because that's kind of like easy to do. It's not like the in-house. And just see what happens, because unless they can get more usage out of their space, it's going to be a losing proposition. And you can't just keep losing money every day that you're open. So, and then plus when you, I don't know if you haven't been inside of a restaurant, we went out about a week or so ago to a restaurant, and you go in and, you know, it's like every other table is roped off and everything is nothing is on the table. It all looks so bad. And your server has a mask on so you can't see them, and you know, you don't have that welcoming thing. The first thing they welcome you with is a thermometer to take your temperature. And you know, you go in and you feel kind of icky, you know. I mean, it's not like a comfortable environment. And you get plastic knives and forks because you can't have silverware, and I'm not sure how people would eat a steak with that, but you know, everything is all wrapped up. You have to ask for everything. It's just not the kind of environment that makes sense for people to, it's not an event to go out and eat or something that you feel warm and good about. You kind of want to feel like you want to get out of there really fast, you know, because it's just not the welcoming feel that restaurants need to have. And as a result, you don't feel very good about rushing back out again to go out to eat.
I can't even, in my experience working with restaurateurs, putting together their concepts, just the amount of time that we would spend looking at the serveware and, you know, how the table is dressed for lunch, and how it looks different at dinner, and the floral. I mean, every little aspect of a restaurant, down to the weight of the silverware in your hand, and you know, what works in a dishwasher and what doesn't, is monumental. So to go to basically like eating airplane food.
That's right. There's no personality to it anymore. You know, it's just sort of there.
And the prices, I mean, the prices are going to be the same or higher because they've got
absolutely
so much to make up, you know, in terms of you know, having lost ground for all these many weeks that's been. And one thing I was a little concerned about it before earlier this morning was going through the headlines, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, big headline, California had started to open up some things, and all of a sudden they said that they've had the biggest spike in California and 2 other states in new cases. And I thought, oh my God, you know, we're going to revert back to where we were.
And that's what you don't know, right? I mean, you know, you could spend all of this time and effort to get yourself open, bring people back on board, and then they close things down again, which is not unlikely to happen at some point in certain places. If they do happen to see peaks, that's the first thing you're going to do, is start locking things down again.
That's you know, concerning, just from a, you know, everybody in business loves to be able to project, you know, forecast earnings and what to do, and you don't know what they're going to be open. Food prep is like a huge, obviously, part of a restaurant. Kitchens are not designed for social distancing. I mean, there's spaces that are pretty, I know, especially like, you know, my experience, again, being mostly in California, the more the real estate goes up, the tighter those kitchens have become, and you're literally on top of people. That, I don't believe, has changed.
They're supposed to practice social distancing even in the kitchens, which nobody has quite figured out what that means yet, because like you said, you know, unless you reconfigure your kitchen totally, and again, like you mentioned, so many times the kitchens are really tightly packed, and the cooks are very, very close to each other, and the food needs to go from one to the other to kind of finish their prep and everything, that it's almost impossible to do it the way they have traditionally been set up. So what I've been hearing lately is that part of this whole rethinking or revisioning of what their restaurants will look like going forward, part of the consideration is when you're looking at the menu items, what menu items can be done with the least number of people getting involved to touch it. Mm-hmm. So they're redesigning the menu to try to accommodate the distancing in the kitchen and what can be done to keep people apart in the kitchen and have as few people touch the item before it goes out. And that is kind of tricky, but that's going to be a really important part of trying to meet the guidelines that you have to meet for the prep in the kitchen. The other problem with the kitchens, not just the kitchen and the people, but is the acquisition of the food items, the food chain. Right. Because in some cases, the items that you need for your menu items now may be really unique items that you have to source very carefully. Truffles, stuff like this that comes to mind that there's a limited supply of. What is happening is that a lot of the supply chains for these items that are rare or pricey have dried up because all the restaurants were closed. So the people who were growing them have either shifted their growing to a different kind of item that is more useful and that people get on a more regular basis, as opposed to the higher priced items that are rarer. So it's interesting because that is also going to affect some of the restaurants, and the uniqueness of the dishes that they had before may have to change because they literally can't. It becomes, kind of like the toilet paper of the kitchen. It's how do you find stuff because there's not enough out there of what you need because people have just not been able to produce it because nobody was buying it. And you've been reading about that a lot with how they've been dumping the dairy products, dumping cheese, dumping a whole lot of production because the restaurants weren't buying it. And when they're not buying it, people aren't going to start producing it anymore until they know for sure what is happening. So I think there's going to be a gap in between, not only in the pricing being higher, but also the sourcing of it and trying to even find the items you need.
Well, I think we're going to find out how incredibly flexible and creative a number of chefs can be because they have to turn into pretzels in order to meet the guidelines and also to be able to integrate with what the supply chain actually is.
Look at what happened with the meat supply recently with the supply houses, the different places that shut down temporarily, that caused a big blip in the beef and the chicken, and the pricing went a little crazy, for a bit. I think it's leveling out a little bit now, but I think that's going to be one of those things that's going to be ongoing. There's always going to be some crisis at some point along the way.
So overall then, when a business owner, a restaurateur, is looking at all the things that we've talked about, impact on the operations, the menu, the staffing, not knowing where people are going to come from or if they're going to come and what their expectations are and how to manage those expectations, what is the number one thing a restaurateur at this moment can actually do to start peeling back that onion? What's the first step they should take to sort of analyze or evaluate where they are at this moment?
I think they have to have a really deep understanding and assessment of where they stand financially overall. You have to understand what kind of debt structure you currently have, what does your leases say, how you envision your business operating, and if it's something that you can change easily, or if it's something that's going to take a while to revision exactly what it is you're doing, and you're going to have to come up with a whole new concept.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people may have the situation where their debt structure is such that it really limits them as to what they can do. I was reading today that there's a group that has a business development loan, and the business development loan requires them to have a certain number of people on payroll. And if they don't have a certain number of people on payroll in a certain amount of time, they have to give back the money. And so what we're starting to see is some of these clawbacks, and they're trying to see if they can have some of that debt relieved so that they don't have the issue. So you may have some underlying issue with your business that will prevent you actually from moving forward. So I think a really good assessment, and I read something else interesting today. They said they had a lot more respect for their CFO now because they were able, they understood that they needed to get some really serious understanding of what the whole picture looked like overall, and what they had the ability to do financially, what were the options that they could take advantage of. And once you know if you have any flexibility and what kind of timing is involved, then you can start to revision what it is you're doing, because you won't have something that will creep up on you and all of a sudden you've spent all of this time trying to rethink your business but forgot about these other items that are sitting and looming out there that's going to come back and bite you, unfortunately.
Well, I think one of the interesting to me is that I'm pretty sure that overall restaurants are like the number one employer of people in small businesses across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
In the United States, small businesses are 97% of all businesses to begin with. So basically, as we eat, so we go. And one of the things that, to your point about that, about not having appreciated the financial endeavor that is necessary to run a restaurant, and that is both internally and externally, from the public that goes to a restaurant. They don't think about the money that's required to make the restaurant happen. And I hate to say it, but a lot of the people that I've worked with over the years who have restaurants, it is a romanticized industry for the most part. It's a passion pursuit. It's a little quixotic in some ways, and
Exactly.
it's like passion over profit and loss, and that inability to really understand that at the end of the day, a P&L is kind of where it lives. The bottom line, if there is no bottom line that's happening for you, then you shouldn't be doing this. These people they're artistic and they're wonderful, and we want to support them. And so it kind of tears at your gut a little bit. Many of the smaller businesses that I've worked with, and the small restaurants in particular, I think you were one of the first people I came across in a independent restaurant environment where there actually was somebody who was handling a CFO function from the beginning. They're generally, in my experience, I've known a number of chefs who started a number of restaurants, and some have been very successful, but they just didn't have that level of either interest or sophistication or money that they wanted to expend to actually do that. And I think that there's probably the majority of restaurants are probably in that basket. The big restaurants, like you mentioned, the chains, the people who managed to claw their way up from one and open up a secondary location have probably either got, they've got some financial understanding internally, and then they were able to attract probably some financial backing somewhere along the line. But when a restaurant is trying to dig themselves out of this hole right now, doing what you do, for example, you're an outside consultant, you can come in, and I would think that a pair of fresh eyes, not involved in the business, that business is not your baby, you're able to come in and like a physician and kind of diagnose and triage appropriately.
And that's one of the things that I do. I had a client last year or so that had been hugely successful at the top line. They were generating revenue like crazy, and they were also losing money like crazy, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And when I got in and started looking at everything, and actually it only took me one meeting with them to see what the problem was, but they had very minimal staff on hand that knew anything on the financial side. They did all the paperwork, they kind of moved things through, they got bills paid, but there was no reporting. Nobody really knew, there was no balance sheet to speak of. There was, they were just operating blind. And it took us a few months to get the right people hired and get them in place. And we got the systems in place. And, by the end of that year, they were getting all of their financials promptly. They could see where everything was going. We made a bunch of changes, and they could finally get some control over their business because they literally really didn't have any. And I think that happens more often than not, that either people get into the business, like you said, it's very much a passion kind of business. They want to do it. They feel passionate about the business. They feel passionate about the guest and what they want it to look like and feel like and all of that sort of thing. And the financial stuff is always sort of the last thing on their mind, because it's more important to have it look and feel the right way and have the food be just wonderful and all of this sort of thing. But the efficiencies that you could get by doing things a different way could help support all of that, but they generally don't think about it because it's not in their purview, unless they have somebody who, if they have a partner who maybe one of the partners is a financial person, and then you have the chef, that's a good match because at least it matches them up. But in most cases, that's not what we see, because they just don't have the ability. Most restaurants don't have very much operating cash on hand. I've never found a restaurant that had a ton of cash on hand, because it's just not the way of the business. And so when you don't have a lot of cash and you have a crisis come up, trying to regroup from that is very, very difficult. Is that a lot of the restaurants that we know will go away. I do think a lot of new restaurants will come along, but they're going to be very different than what the restaurants were before.
Well, I know some of the materials that I've been looking at, because I have worked in the industry for a number of years as a consultant. I tend to keep up on reading with, all the people that are sort of like the leading lights in the restaurant industry in terms of operational and design, et cetera. And one of the things that they all seem to be in agreement on is that this has provided a really unique opportunity to do a reset, an industry-wide reset.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, okay, they're like, when you talk about slash and burn and we're going to go out and start over. And one of the things that I thought was really unusual about that is the mindset that it will take. Coming out of it, I think people will be much more aware about the financial side, but I'm not sure that you're ever going to strip the passion and the romanticized version of what's going on. But for example, now that I'm thinking back on probably 24 restaurants that I've worked with, I don't think that other than 2 or 3 of them, the chef had ever costed out the menu. Didn't even know how to cost out a menu. And when you start peeling back the onion, and I, coming from the branding marketing side, it was just my look was, okay, on the menu engineering side, how do we perform so that we can provide what the guest wants, make the chef happy, and be true to what the brand is. And menu costing wasn't even like on the table. So that was a unique experience to me. And I thought, oh my goodness. So it almost seems to me like we need to have a restaurant boot camp. You're really thinking about going into this industry before you get to go in there. I mean, before anybody picks up a spoon, maybe you should look at these, 500 things that you need to be aware of in order to open up a business that's actually going to survive. I'm trying to remember what that joke was. Remember, it's like, what was it? How do you make $2 million owning a restaurant? Oh wait, no. How do you make $1 million owning a restaurant? Yeah. Start with 2 and wait 6 months. Yeah, that one. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of people let the restaurant run them rather than them running the restaurant.
Mhm.
And it's like if they can get through a day without having a major crisis, then that's successful. And, they don't really look at all the different ways that you really, and it's, it's been changing a lot because the legal landscape has been changing a lot. Restaurants are getting sued every kind of which way
Right.
all the time, from employees, from guests, from everybody you can imagine. And that used to not be the case. And I think the whole landscape of how you ran a restaurant before is not really going to work going forward.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean you have to be less passionate about what it is you want to do or what you want to bring to people in terms of what you want them to experience. I just think people are going to have to be smarter about it. And they're going to have to look at the possibilities of what happens if something like this happens again. What happens if you only have a dine-in restaurant and you don't develop these other revenue centers, whether it's takeout, or patio dining or something. You have to be able to have multiple ways of getting your product out there.
Mhm.
And just having one way is not going to work. I was just about like Denny's. I mean, you think about Denny's or you think about the bigger restaurants, the chain restaurants, you figure, oh, they've got it made. There is no drive-in at Denny's.
Right.
Denny's does not have a drive-through. All of their restaurants had to close. And they said they never had to do drive-in before or pickup or takeout before. I mean, it was all minimal. So they had to shift like crazy. I've heard a lot of the Starbucks are closing and shifting to simply all drive-through
Mhm.
Starbucks, and they're changing their processes to make it a faster process for people to go through. And, so I think people are starting to revision what they can do. Some of the restaurants here have been really creative in terms of, if the kind of food they did before was really nice, wonderful French dining that was elaborately done and beautifully plated, sticking it in a box doesn't really work. You don't get the same satisfaction out of it. So one of the restaurants here, they totally changed what they did, and they started doing dumplings with the French flair. And they're wonderful, and they have these wonderful sauces, and you buy them, and they're all frozen. So
Okay.
you buy them, and you can buy a dozen at a time, take them home, eat them when you want. They have the toppings, and it's really created a whole new line of business for him that he intends on keeping going forward because everybody enjoys it so much.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of possibilities for people to take what you're doing and modifying it so that you can come up with something that is more sustainable going forward. But in any case, none of it is cheap. None of it is easy to do. And it is going to take time for people to make that shift. And it just depends on how well settled you are to be able to make that shift. A lot of the government loans can help, but there's so many restrictions around them in some cases. So they don't work as well for restaurants as they do for some other businesses in terms of forgiveness and all of that, which you've been hearing in the news anyway. So I do think there'll be other types of things coming up, and it just depends on if some of these places can take advantage of maybe a different kind of support to get them through and to help them change.
One of the other things I wanted to touch on very briefly was in the restaurant environment of operations. There are a lot of systems that are in place. For example, POS. The POS systems,
Mm-hmm.
Many restaurants are locked into legacy POS systems just because they were there. And I mean, there were the original ones, and then there were secondary ones that came along, and now we have the touchless POS runoff apps, which are much less expensive. Are you seeing that probably there'll be a lot of shift in that area in terms of operations, just being able to slim down in terms of
I
both
think so.
cost?
Yeah, I think so. because the legacy systems, while they're good, they're very costly to maintain, and they're clunkier. You don't have the ability in some cases to do the mobile pay and that sort of thing that you do, or if you have it, it's sort of clunky in that they have kind of devices that they're using, but they're not fully integrated like they should be. And I think the newer systems that are out there, whether it's Toast, Labu, any of these new ones that are out there, they can do a lot of the same things, integrate with the financial packages and all that are out there. And the setup is so much easier and it's cleaner. People understand it a lot more. And you don't have this huge investment in hardware that you need with the POS systems that are out there right now. And a lot of them are going to be touchless going forward. And that's, I don't think any of the legacy systems right now are touchless in any way.
Yeah, I think pretty much all of them require at least the use of a finger somewhere along the line.
Yep.
I'm curious about another thing. I know that when we first went into pandemic mode and everything was closing down, a really wonderful thing happened. Everybody said, hey, let's go out and support our local restaurants and buy gift cards. If a gift card has been sold to someone and then that restaurant goes out of business and you spent $200 supporting your local business down the street because you love them, what happens with that? Are they a creditor or do they just lose the money?
Just goes away.
Okay, I didn't know if there was any legal liability for the restaurant to actually have to.
No, if you go out of business, it's just lost.
It's gone. Okay.
Yeah. If you don't use it before a business closes, it's just lost. And that's with any of the retail stores. Pier 1 is closing all of their stores, and they sent out a notice saying that if you have any gift cards, use them right away, because once the store is closed, there's no place to use them. So they just sort of go away.
If somebody were thinking, this is the time I want to get into the restaurant business, after hearing all of this and living through the pandemic and part one, this could be just part one, what would be your word of caution? Somewhere in there's got to be some good news. And I think, for people who see opportunities in spite of what happens around them, what would you suggest that they look at, like to get oriented and make a right decision?
I think they have to plan a lot more carefully what they want to do. And I think right now is not the time to start a new restaurant, because my guess is, as I said, the shakeout is going to come pretty strongly over the next 6 months or more. A lot of restaurants will probably be closing, which means there's going to be a lot of space available. So what you don't want to do right now is get into a lease that maybe is too rich for you. So you want to be careful. Plus, a lot of times when restaurants leave, they leave everything there. So a lot of times you can get a fully built out restaurant already with just a few changes to do what it is that you need to do. So I would really plan out and take the time to look at it from a lot of different aspects, such that what happens if you don't want to be strictly online or have it be the majority, because what happens if there's a blip in your online abilities? If something happens, you don't want it to be strictly dine in. You don't want it to be in a place where people can't get to you. Well, some of the restaurants had to close because they had no place to park. People couldn't come pick up their stuff because they couldn't park, and they can't do a drive-through because there's no place to build it. So I think looking really carefully at where you want a restaurant to be, what you want it to be, try to figure out what's going to happen in the future. And this involves getting other people involved. So you have to have some professional help along the way to be sure that you're looking at it the right way, and you get input from a bunch of different people and different specialties, so that you can protect yourself as much as possible moving forward. So that once you do decide on the concept that you want, you have a clear path on how you're going to handle all the other pieces of the business.
So site analysis becomes important once again.
Oh, yeah. Can you imagine the places that are going to be available coming up soon? I mean, it's amazing.
I walked past quite a few of them this morning. I do a 5 mile walk through the city every day, and I was amazed. I was watching, actually, the fun thing was I was early enough, I was able to see stand-up going on in several different locations that I walked by, and this is around 7:30 this morning. So delivery trucks were starting to show up, which was kind of a good sign. And then I saw, people in wait staff outfits and patios being set up, and I thought, wow, it's great to see a little sign of life that I was really happy about. But then again, your heart just breaks when you see how far apart those tables are, and how you know that in order to make anything happen financially, every seat's got to be filled every day. I mean, they can't have any kind of hiccup. And I think to your point about not jumping in right this moment, if you definitely wanted to go into this industry, that it would, step back and look at it through non-rose colored glasses. You had talked a little bit before about mind mapping. And I think that that's a really valuable tool for people to, figure out concept and brand. And then the diversification. I love the idea of a restaurant not putting all of its eggs in one basket. And there are very few restaurants where they go into it thinking, well, I'll get to that someday. And I think maybe the bottom line warning on this, or the cautionary tale about this, is that you need to think about those things before, as opposed to after.
Exactly.
After the boom dropped on you. So
you have to build it in. I read where one restaurant was making the meals to go, where they assembled all of the ingredients and was selling it not prepared, but like you had all the ingredients and they told you what to do with it, and it was from this restaurant. But not only were they selling it to the public, but they had arranged with one of the grocery chains for the groceries to carry them.
Oh.
And what a great idea, right? Because people go to the grocery all the time. So, and you see Starbucks in groceries. I mean, you've got to be able to get your product out there in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a huge business to do that. A lot of groceries like to have local businesses involved in the items that they carry. So there's, again, there's a lot, if you can get creative about it, there's a lot of ways to get things out there that are not terribly costly to you. Once you get them prepared, you can get them out there and get the public to buy them.
Parting words of wisdom.
Anytime you run across something like this, it gives you a chance to reflect and to really stop and analyze what it is you're doing. Because most people in business are so busy doing day to day, they don't have time to really stop and think about their business. What the benefit, as painful as it's been, the benefit to the pandemic has been, it has forced a lot of businesses to look at what they do, how they do it, and if it's something that they really want to stay in. And I think that reflection time is really, really good. I think a certain number of people will say, no, I'll just stop and give up at this point. Other people will look at it like, this is a really good opportunity. It's given me a chance to rethink what I'm doing, and it's re-energized me to want to do something different. And it can be a good opportunity to move forward. So I think instead of looking at the gloom as much, you can also look at it as an opportunity to find a new way of doing what it is that you love to do.
Fantastic. Well, Brenda, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on to discuss restaurants. And I know that we'll have you come back and talk about some other industries as well, because your knowledge is just vast and all encompassing. If people want to reach out to you, I will have connecting information below in the box, so that we'll be able to link people up with you if they want to reach out. Because I think good financial planning for a business from the get-go, it's not just what the great recipes are, but there's actually a business plan. Oh my God.
Right.
And I know, sadly, I when things are going really, really well, that's one of the first things to fall by the wayside. People decide, wow, there's just money falling out of the sky, and everything's going up, and there's so many people, and it's all great. And they don't bother with the business plan. and then all of a sudden you have a black swan event or something that is even less than this, that just throws everything off its path. So the ability for people to reach out and connect with you if they need some assistance would probably be a good thing. So thank you very much. And I'm going to 3, 2, 1 back, and now we're done. And wow, that was great.
Thank you.